Good evening, everybody in Dhaka, and good morning to Danielle, and good night to Celine, who's uh, later in the evening than we are. Today, we are very, very pleased and privileged, in fact, to have one of our um, visiting researchers from the US who has been working with ICAD for many years, coming and going and spending time with us. Unfortunately, because of the lockdown and the COVID situation, she hasn't been able to come recently, but hopefully once things are better, she can come back again. Her name is Danielle Falzon. She's doing a PhD at Brown University in Rhode Island in the United States. And she has recently published a very interesting paper on expertise and exclusivity, whose decisions count in terms of adaptation to climate change in Bangladesh. And this is a particular topic of very great interest to us at ICAT because we are great believers in bottom-up, locally led adaptation. But we need to also find the right frame of description and engagement with the academic community working on adaptation to explain it. Simply just saying bottom-up, locally led is not enough. We have to have good evidence to demonstrate what we mean and demonstrate what is wrong with non-locally led or top-down. So I'm very pleased to have Danielle with us today. After Danielle's presentation, we have two designated discussants. Firstly, Celine Ducruz, who's been working with us as another visiting researcher, but based in Beijing. A lot of experience working with slum dwellers in many cities around the world. And then our own Ishtiaq Ahmed, who is leading our work on resilience. So without further ado, let me hand over to Danielle to give the presentation. Then I will ask Celine and Ishtiaq to give their feedback, and then we'll open the floor for, I hope, a lively discussion. Danielle, please go ahead.
Thanks so much, Liam. Yeah, I'm really excited to be here. And as I was telling folks earlier on the call, I'm excited to get feedback from all of you since you know the context. Some of you may be better than me, so I'd love to hear what your thoughts are. It's nice to also not have to explain what adaptation is to a group of people, which is what I normally have to do in academic settings. So this will be a fun presentation for me. Thank you, Fatia, also for doing the slides for me. I'll just say like next slide or something, or click or something to indicate when to go to the next one. So as Dr. Hector said, I am presenting a bit about my paper, Expertise and Exclusivity. The paper's title is Expertise and Exclusivity on in Adaptation Decision Making. So I'm focused a bit on Bangladesh in this presentation because I'll add a bit about my dissertation work as well. Next slide, please. Fatia, can you hit the next slide, please? Dr. just gave a pretty overarching overview. Can you go back? Sorry. It doesn't matter that much. I'm Danielle. I'm a PhD candidate in sociology at Brown. Like Dr. Huck said, I've been working with ECAD since 2017, or I guess 2016 technically. I met some of the ECAD team at the COP, the UN negotiations at COP 22, I believe it was, in Marrakesh. I started coming to Bangladesh just to learn more about adaptation and what the country was doing on adaptation, and ended up deciding to shape my dissertation around it. And I mean, I first thank you all to the ECAD team and to Dr. Huck for kind of facilitating all of my research and really helping me out in getting situated in Bangladesh and getting everything started, especially in the beginning, and for providing a wonderful team of like researchers and interlocutors to chat with at the very least while I've been doing my research. So I've really enjoyed my connection with ECAD, and I'm excited to show you what I've been doing for the last 4 years. Can you hit the next slide, Fatih? Thank you. So this is my article. That's what I'll be presenting on today. It's part of a special issue in a journal called Current Opinion in Environmental Sustainability. And it's a special issue on climate decision making. And I know it's not a journal that's very easily accessible. A lot of universities and organizations don't have access to it. So I am more than happy to share the article for my PDF, the PDF for my article, and also I have access to the full special issue. So if you want to read any of the other articles in the special issue, there's a lot of interesting stuff in there. I'm happy to send out those PDFs as well. So please feel free to contact me about those. Next slide. Okay, so to say a little bit about my dissertation in Bangladesh, just one moment. Um, uh, this isn't an empirical article, but it's informed by the work that I've been doing in Bangladesh. So I have been working to study how organizations are approaching adaptation, with a focus on Bangladesh as one of the key places where adaptation is actually taking place. And there's a lot of effort to actually do adaptation. So my research is at this meso-organizational level. So I'm not necessarily assessing whether projects are successful or whether people are doing adaptation properly, but about the inequalities and power and structural barriers in adaptation planning, or in the process of planning, the proposal and the funding process that impacts how adaptation ultimately gets carried out on the ground. So far my research has consisted of 91 interviews with actors and organizations involved in adaptation in Bangladesh, 36 interviews and focus groups with local beneficiaries at project sites, and others, and different field visits to project sites, including observations at meetings and conferences, including the Gobeshona meeting and the UN negotiations over the last few years. Next slide, please. Okay. So this is just basically what I'll cover in the presentation. I'm going to go over the key arguments of the COSUST article, which that's the journal's sort of shortened version of the name. I'll tell you a little bit more about this concept of the adaptation field that I'm proposing and that I'm using to shape my dissertation, and then that'll help me set up what I'm arguing in one of the chapters of my dissertation, which I'm calling the business of adaptation. So I'll give you a bit about that argument as well, and I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts on that. And that's where a lot more of my empirical work will come in. Next slide, please. All right, so the COSUST article. Next slide. So the COSUST article central question is, who decides how communities in the global south are adapting or adapt to global climate change? And now, why is this an important question? So the people making adaptation decisions have significant power to shape communities' futures. And that's in part because the definition of adaptation, you see the IPCC definition up there at the top, it's so broad and it can include so many things. So planners have substantial leeway in determining what ultimately gets enacted as adaptation. In a 2015 article, Erickson et al. Demonstrate that, and you can see the quote there, any adaptation decision, whether made by an individual adjusting his or her livelihood strategy or a policymaker designing formal adaptation strategies, is the product of prioritizing some interests over others and privileging and experiencing some biophysical changes over others, hearing some voices and ignoring others. So there's a lot of choosing who to listen to and what to prioritize in adaptation planning. In that same article, they argue that knowledge and subjectivity and authority shape what particular adaptation interests and actions take place, and consequently that this alters the fundamental attributes of society when they actually implement the projects. And I'm focusing on the global south in this article, as of course I do in my dissertation by looking at Bangladesh, but looking at those decision makers, those with the funding or who hold influential positions in international organizations and NGOs, they're often those who are considered elites, especially foreign elites. And this makes it a part of a larger story of global North-South relations and inequality, and not just like unique to a specific case. Next slide, please. Okay, so the main problem that I identify in the article is that while locals are increasingly exalted as those who know their community and context best, it's the professionals in policy, science, development, and finance who are constructed as the valid experts and decision makers, and they're the ones who are listened to. Next slide, please. Okay, so to think about the whole universe of adaptation actors that are working on adaptation globally and within countries, I'm introducing this concept of the adaptation field in my dissertation, and I do so in this article as well. So people have done something sort of similar by referring to these actors as an adaptation regime or a climate regime, but I find that the term regime is somewhat imprecise and inaccurate because it suggests that it's a coordinated set of actors working toward a specific end, whereas in reality, adaptation is more disjointed and haphazard. The project kind of happen as they do. It's not all part of a unified whole. So focusing on a regime, I think, obscures the diversity of actors and their agency in adaptation. So using a field, I bring in this concept from sociology of a social field. And in sociology, a field is a set of actors that are connected through a common set of logics, norms, and assumptions, and they compete for power through the accumulation of different forms of capital. And put in a less jargony way, that means that fields contain a bunch of actors that are interconnected through the same rules and goals, not necessarily through interacting directly. And those with the most power have the greatest influence in shaping the rules and goals. And so ultimately, I argue in this article that the construction of expertise in the adaptation field around the advice of these highly educated professionals, rather than around locals' priorities and adjustments in their practices, is a key mechanism through which decision-making power has been unequally distributed. Next slide, please. Okay. So I probably don't need to tell most of you about the problems of top-down planning, but what I'm saying in the article is that a lack of trust between the funders, the implementers, and national governments has led to this top-down process and top-down monitoring and governance in projects, even if they argue that their planning was somewhat bottom-up. So even the structures of governance and financing that are established under the UNFCCC, the UN negotiations, they hesitate to hand full control over funding allocation to recipient countries. So still you have like the donor countries having significant power in determining what gets funded. And ultimately, this top-down approach concentrates resources and power among elite actors in the field and reproduces inequalities. And so ultimately, this might fail to get support to the neediest. It might ignore local politics and social complexities. It could depoliticize adaptation. And it can reproduce mistakes that have already been made in development by not kind of radically shifting the approach to adaptation. Okay, next slide, please. And so instead of being brought in as real informants and sources of knowledge and expertise, local people are often selectively incorporated into projects through strategies like community risk assessments, which are good, don't get me wrong. I don't think that we shouldn't do community risk assessments, but they sort of bring locals into the conversation, but then the decision-making power is still in the hands of like the NGOs, for example, who serve as translators for from what the people tell them to what ultimately gets decided as the plan for the project. And what I'm saying in this article is that we don't want people to just be data sources. We want them to be partners in adaptation, because this inequality of power exacerbates climate injustices by making those who have the most stake in adaptation being effective, they have the least agency in determining how it actually takes place. And they're the ones that are going to have to ultimately deal with the consequences of maladaptation if that's what takes place, and ineffective interventions that are left behind, but don't necessarily help them out. So instead of just expanding like strategies like community risk assessments to incorporate people more, it's crucial that these structures are actually transformed, because when you do it, when locals aren't brought in like fully as partners, you have these consequences like risking maladaptation, limiting effectiveness, restricting locals' agency in determining their own futures. And it also forecloses these unknown possibilities for what adaptation can be and what what could be adaptive and what could really make a difference in the face of climate change. We don't know what they might suggest and what expertise from the bottom up might create in terms of adaptation projects. Okay, so next slide, please. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit more. Now I'm going to get away from the paper a little bit and toward more of my other dissertation research. So to expand on the concept of the adaptation field a bit, to give you a bit more context for what I'm about to tell you. Next slide, please. So think of like the adaptation field like an academic field or a field of research. So you're all involved in different academic fields and fields of research, or you were maybe as an undergrad or a grad student. So you're aware of the other people in your field that are working on the same thing as you, or that just like I'm a sociologist, I'm aware of other sociologists in my field. I don't necessarily know them personally, but we all do work that follows a similar set of guidelines for how we do research and how you write up your papers. And the adaptation field is sort of the same thing. And like you're also connected to people in other fields based on areas of interest and topics of study. And so that's how we see what I'm trying to illustrate in this diagram. And again, happy to get feedback on this diagram if it's unhelpful, is that you have the adaptation field, but it's also overlapping with fields. So like it's overlapping, of course, with the development field, and you have actors that exist in both fields. It might also be overlapping with like the government of Bangladesh, that could also be considered a field, for example. And you can see in there, it's a little bit, there's a lot of lines and dots, I know, but you can see that there's a national field that I'm designating. And while the larger field is a global adaptation field. So while international organizations are located in the global field, in Bangladesh, this is Bangladesh specific now, Bangladeshi organizations and local NGOs would be located within this sort of nested national field. And so I'm still working through developing this concept a bit for my dissertation, but I'm happy to talk more about it if anyone's interested. Yeah, I'm going to elaborate on it a bit more right now. And you can see sort of the levels of actors that I'm thinking about in my different categories on the left hand of that slide there. Okay. Okay, next slide, please. Okay. So the advantage of looking at adaptation as a field is that it helps me understand how power is distributed in the field, and relatedly, how inequality persists in it. So this graph is only illustrative. It's not based on like numerical or like measured data, but I'm using it to show how some organizations have more power in the field, and that they are organizations that are more globally oriented. And all of the local NGO names there are pseudonyms. Okay, so can you click one more time? Please, Fatia. Thank you. Okay, so I'm drawing this line for elites in the field. So that's usually how we think about social fields in sociology, as elites and non-elites. And so I'm using, so I consider these organizations above the line as elites in the field, and their elite status is based, and power is based on them having control over money in the field and having a good reputation. You can click one more time, Fatia. Sorry. I promise there isn't much more animation in this. So it's based on them having money and a good reputation, so that they're considered the ones who know how to do adaptation and to do it well. And it, as I say in my article, they're the ones that are considered experts. Next slide, please. So now getting into my argument in my business of adaptation chapter. Next slide, please. I'm looking at this thing that I'm calling the business of adaptation. So when I was doing my fieldwork, I was very struck by this like language of business that I kept, or what I call the language of business. I may decide to call it something slightly different in the dissertation, but this like businessy language that was characterizing a lot of adaptation conversations that I didn't expect coming from like an environmental background. I was like sort of struck by like this one donor agency mentioned to me that you have to make a business case for your projects, saying that you have to include the 4 E's that make up value for money, like economy, efficiency, effectiveness, and equity. And then an international organization representative told me that presenting only vulnerability in an adaptation proposal has become obsolete, that you need to make this business case as well. And another government person told me that adaptation is right now supply driven based on what the donors want, and ideally it would be demand driven based on what the vulnerable people need. So you can click one more time, Fatia. And this is just part of the words that I kept hearing over and over again. And it led me to this question. Next slide. How does the language and logic of business shape climate change adaptation, and what are the effects? So what is this sort of framing for understanding and thinking about adaptation do in terms of like influencing how adaptation ultimately takes place, and who has a say in it? Okay, next slide, please. All right, so the business of adaptation is a set of logics or norms that guides the action of actors in the adaptation field. And it has these three components that I'm going to illustrate now. You can just click like 3 or 4 times. I didn't realize this was animated, sorry. Thank you. Okay, so fearing corruption. First, fearing corruption, elites require proof of organizational and financial capacity before distributing resources. Then second, to get the greatest value for their money, elites, funders in particular, prefer projects that are cost effective and that generate high returns. And then third, to ensure that an investment will have a positive impact, the funders demand evidence that demonstrates intervention effectiveness, even as they seek innovative projects. And ultimately, this leads to practices that marginalize local actors that often have the best understanding of local needs and the most at stake. Next slide, please. Okay. So elite actors in the adaptation field want to ensure that any funds and resources they provide will not be wasted. So they require that organizations apply for funding or to implement a project, or they require that the organizations applying for funding or to implement a project demonstrate high organizational capacity. And so often the GOB and local NGOs are considered untrustworthy. And at the core of that sentiment is this like fear about corruption and mismanagement of funds. And because funders view themselves as investing their money to achieve a desired result through their projects, ideally one that they can leverage to enhance their reputation in the field, they look to organizations' credentials and financial reputation to ensure that they are making a good investment. So in 2013, Transparency International Bangladesh concluded in its report on climate finance that developed countries may not deliver on their climate finance pledges if there's any doubt that the money will be used effectively. In addition, another donor told me that in addition to looking at a country's capacity in, or excuse me, a partner's capacity in one donor agency representative said to me that in addition to looking at a partner's capacity or a partner's like project plan, you also look to their capacity to manage the money and to do they have anti-corruption strategies built into their sort of transparency mechanisms. And then last, another strategy to mitigate this risk of corruption and mismanagement of funds is to increase co-financing. And in these cases, the funder doesn't have to supply all of the funds, and there's an expectation that the partner organization, or even in the case of like the Green Climate Fund, the country, that their increased ownership by providing money themselves will encourage them to manage the funds properly and to be more careful about it. So while this fear of corruption is not unfounded, and it's true that funds might be mismanaged even unintentionally if an organization lacks robust accounting infrastructures, the distrust that elite actors in the adaptation field exhibit toward local actors because of these concerns justifies what eventually becomes the hoarding of adaptation resources and decision-making power among the elites. Meanwhile, the local organizations struggle to access resources directly from funders. All right, next slide, please. So in addition to ensuring that their investment is not lost to corruption and mismanagement, funders in the adaptation field want to get the best value for their money. And to do this, elite actors often prioritize cost effectiveness and returns in their selection of projects. So these actors don't want their investments to go to waste because it could damage their reputation in the field. So first, these actors want their investment, or they want the projects to be cheap. And so I've been in part of several conversations, one conversation in particular with several sort of like elites in the adaptation field who are arguing that projects have to be cost effective and not too expensive. But others in the conversation pointed out that reaching the most vulnerable populations is not always cheap. But this resonated with comments I'd heard from other representatives or other interviewees who had commented that some populations were just too remote and that designing a project to reach them would be too difficult and too costly to implement. And then these organizations, the elites also want a big return on their investment. So I spoke to one organization that had wanted to start a project with the tiger widows in the Southwest. But he said that unfortunately, we didn't create any donor priority to work with the tiger widows because they're not huge. Only you can find about 1,500. So because there weren't that many, only 1,500, they weren't able to get their project funded. I also heard from folks that they want to avoid duplication. I heard from one INGO representative saying that often we try to see which are the arenas where people didn't touch. So if you think about the Southwest Belt, studies are saying that around 6 million people are climate change effective. So we can't go with all of them. So we exclude those people that have less vulnerability, who are supported by other program or projects, and with whom we feel like we will not be able to create that much vibration. So what we see here is like a systematic prioritization of projects that are cheap, that have big investments, and that are not not duplicating efforts that already exist. And that seems at the expense of ensuring that you're addressing the most vulnerable populations, the people who need the most help, even if it's expensive, even if there's only 1,500 people, and even if it's something that's been done before. If it's effective, that might not be the worst thing in the world. I had some folks tell me that there's no problem with duplication yet because we haven't done enough adaptation for duplication to be a problem. Okay, next slide, please. All right, and then the third component of the business adaptation is that it needs to be evidence-based, but also innovative. So their elites in the adaptation field are not only working to protect their reputation by avoiding corruption and increasing the value of money for the value for money in their investments, they're also seeking to enhance their reputations through novel projects. Funders seek projects that are innovative, approaching climate change problems with new solutions, and ones that are scalable and replicable to increase the potential that their investment will serve as a model for others in the field. However, even more importantly, the projects must be evidence-based, and evidence-based means that the interventions have been tested and proven to achieve the project goals such that they can eventually be reported as successful. And what I've seen in Bangladesh is in many countries in the global south, it can be difficult to supply that information to funders because there's often a lack of baseline data that can give information about the state of an area prior to the intervention, and only elite, well-resourced global actors in the adaptation field can fund robust feasibility studies to test out their interventions. So while building the evidence base for a proposed project is difficult for even an international NGO like UNDP or an INGO, it's nearly impossible for local NGOs with little funding and access to data and resources. I think I saw that somebody just put their hand up. Do we want to do questions now?
Don't worry,
Okay.
just carry on.
All
We'll
right,
do questions later.
we'll go back to that. Okay, amazing. Yeah, so it's very difficult for local NGOs to do these feasibility studies. I had one INGO representative tell me that a feasibility study can be a project proposal all on its own. And then on feasibility, another international organization told me that sometimes they actually give some innovation financing, and they give it for more innovation, but that only to mature the business case of the project so that it has future probability of being funded by a different organization. So it's all sort of about like getting together the evidence and the innovation, or like the novelty argument for why a project should be funded by a donor. And that's more according to what the donor's interested in than maybe what the actual local people need or want. Okay, next slide, please. So these components of the business of adaptation systematically marginalize local actors in the adaptation field. And this is a problem because projects planned by people with little connection to the place can lead to short-sighted and inappropriate adaptation interventions that can even lead to maladaptation. And maladaptation and the social and environmental implications of poorly conceptualized adaptation projects has become a central concern in the adaptation literature and also among practitioners. So in response, as you all know at ECAD, like there's been a call for locally led adaptation, which is just, I mean, it's locally led adaptation is great, but it also follows a long line of people saying that adaptation needs to be more locally specific and locally informed. So the problem then when with the current structures and what I heard from a lot of local organizations in describing how they're marginalized through the system, I heard some common themes. So one common theme was that they lack the skills, as you can see on the slide here, to actually prepare the proposals that these donors and funders want. So this local NGO representative said to me that, and this is a local NGO, like in a their headquarters is not in a city. So they said that our main problem is in proposal writing, less capacity to write a proposal. It's not about time, we have the time, it's the skill. And he says that he's not very studied in English, he's just studied in this area. He studied at a high school near where I was staying, and he said, I'm not an expert. It's a very remote area. It's very hard to keep some qualified staff. So we're very ambitious. We try to do something. We give a circular for an ad. Sorry, the screen share just stopped, I think. Batia, are you still there?
Fatia,
Okay.
have we lost you?
We might have lost Fatia. That's okay. I can share my screen if that's okay, and I'll finish up. I only have like 3 more slides.
Go ahead.
Okay. Just one moment. Okay, can you all see that?
Yep.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Excellent. Okay, so they're basically what he's describing here. It's very hard to keep people who are very highly qualified in that area to actually work on the projects. A lot of the people who are most skilled in writing proposals, for example, leave and they go somewhere else, and that's a problem for their organization. I also heard from a lot of local organizations that they lack time and capacity and funds. So you can see from what's underlined there, he said you need huge time, huge capable people. And we have a very limited budget, limited funds. It's just not possible for them to put that same amount of effort in as an international organization might be able to do. And he said, we need to change this mechanism. Okay. And then last, I heard from folks that they were taking the burden for INGOs by being the ones who are really implementing the project. And he said, I call it he called them so-called INGOs. And he said, I call it so-called because they feel proud of saying international NGOs. And you see, they're actually the major beneficiaries of projects, but they don't do anything about implementation, just monitoring and recording and all these things. But the full burdens of monitoring are done by the local NGOs. We take the burden, the whole field level, rain, sun, cold, bad weather, all these things. We have to go and work and implement. So they create the pressures and they demand this report and that report, all these things. They travel to the project sites with 4-wheelers and Jeeps. Our guys ride bicycles and motorcycles, sometimes the local bus. There, meaning the INGOs, salaries are very high, lots of benefits and all this. It's a problem for our country because if you get a lot of money from, let's say, USAID, then the intermediaries make a lot of money and a very small amount comes to the field. So these are the problems that I heard from folks over and over again. And just to share some final thoughts before we get to the discussions. Oh, excuse me, sorry, I can't see everything because of the screen sharing. Oh, there we go, okay. All right, so ultimately, I'm arguing that there are enormous inequalities in power between actors working on adaptation at the global level and in these international organizations, and those that are working at the national and local level. And the people who are most removed from the local context are often those whose knowledge and expertise are most valued, and those who can access funding and resources most easily. So elite organizations in the adaptation field are often acting to protect and enhance their reputations rather than to produce the best adaptation projects, though they may also produce good adaptation projects in the process. And the local level or locally led adaptation effort, excuse me, is an important development in adaptation, but it also requires change not only in the discourse, as Dr. Akka was saying before, but in the structures through which adaptation projects are being planned, proposed, and funded, because these structural barriers are going to continue to marginalize local organizations and keep them from accessing funds directly and influencing the planning process unless the structures are changed. So that's all I have for you. So thank you all so much, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from Celine and Ishtiaq and hearing your questions later on.
Great, thank you very much,
And I'll
Danielle.
stop sharing now.
Excellent presentation. Let's move on to our two designated discussants, and then I'll open the floor for further comments and questions. Celine, do you want to go first?
Yes. So Danielle, thank you for your wonderful paper and presentation. It really inspired me because it pressed many of my buttons. And I have never had the language to say what you said, and I was very envious and wish I could have put it theoretically. Then you don't come out screaming and ranting and getting mad at what's happening in the development world. But having said that, my own experience has made me reflect very deeply about power and the nature of power, and how, and while we understand that funders and people far away and these relationships can be unequal, it is hard to understand when it's happening within your own family, right? And I think that is something that hits you in the gut because you have no tools to deal with that. When you have an external enemy, it's very easy to say, you are coming in the way, you funder, you're trouble, or you university, you're trouble to me. But when it is happening very subtly, and communities also fall for this. And yeah, so I don't know how to say it. So basically, power is something that it doesn't matter whether you're a slum dweller or whether you are the president of a country. You deal with power in the same way. And you see that level of madness happening in a slum, and you see that level of madness happening at a country level, right? So that's human nature. But what do we need to do as external agents to ensure that we create an environment to the extent possible where you protect these spaces for communities to grow? Because once they fall into that trap, and it is part of being, so my other definition of your adaptation field would be that it is not just single actors operating in their little worlds and doing, being powerful or less powerful. It is the interaction of all those actors. So even the community is in that game. So when they see their NGO bullshitting and, giving a storyline that has never happened, they think it's okay. And they think that's what you're supposed to do. And so for me, these are very ethical issues. These are moral issues in development. And I feel for the first time, after spending so many years in development, in adaptation, you'll have the courage to begin to look at these issues. In the development world, nobody talks about these issues. It happens and it's all, put under the carpet, and then you have another nice language to hide the other part of it. So you're busy finding reasons to believe your own lies. And there's something very not right about that. And I think that is a crux of the problem, even of not being able to adapt, because when you're not authentic and you don't have the capacity to look at your own vulnerabilities and show that to funders, then the funders don't grow, you don't grow, communities don't grow, right? So I feel something needs to change. And how do we do that? So some of the solutions that I've seen that have worked to a certain extent, one is to create a voice and identity for the most vulnerable groups. So as they become stronger, as they have agency, as they are able to come to the table and negotiate with you, they are able to put their ideas across. The second thing I've seen, when you're actually giving funding, we had the Gates project in Uganda, gave the money to different actors. So there were checks and balances in place. So if the communities bullshitted, the local government knew. If the local government bullshitted, the community knew. If the NGO bullshitted, the other two, So in one project, you actually got them to work with each other. Now, the local government in normal circumstances would never work with poor communities. It is, but because the funding came and they had to work, and Gates Foundation said that this is the criteria, they decided to work with poor communities. So I feel if we are able to create a platform by which we are able to redefine these relationships between power structures that motivate power structures to deal with those less powerfully, it can be done. And then the third thing is Gobeshana, which was very insightful for me. So when Gobeshana was being planned, it was my first Gobeshana online, but I think I went one Gobeshana before in Bangladesh. And I couldn't understand, because everybody normally has this thing, you call some community leaders there, and they give some speech and there's some token representation, and they don't know what the hell is happening in the big picture, but they come say something and they go and they think they're doing something that is going to be useful to them, and they hope something good will come out of it. So when I asked Salim, and Salim, this was very insightful for me, and your reaction, when you said, no, at the Gobeshana, it's only going to be intermediaries and other people talking, and we'll have a separate parallel network for the communities to talk. And that was so powerful, because for the first time, communities had their own space to sit and do it at their pace, and to understand the concepts in a level they could understand, and to start from their stories without listening and trying to then. So I was last week at the CBA conference, and it was hysterical. So, these community leaders have done grandiose work of changing institutional arrangements in their countries, but they come to a Climate 101 session and they're talking about creating briquettes and collecting plastic bottles. The inane, they're talking of like simple mitigation things that they're doing because they think that's the language they have to use in a climate environment. So yeah, so I don't want to point a finger at one actor or the other, but I feel we're all in this together, and we all have to help each other to be able to get out of this situation. And your paper really does justice to doing, we need to circulate this paper among funders, especially among NGOs, because they think they're holier than thou, and they think because they're closest to the poor, they do no wrong. Thank you. Thank you so much. And I look forward to continuing this conversation with you, Daniel.
Yeah, thank you so much, Celine. I look forward to talking more on this.
Thank you, Celine. So the point I will take back from that is that it's about power, but it's also about a hierarchy of power, with the the topmost are the internationals, but then there are also structures within countries, national versus local government versus local communities, and then within communities, men versus women, adults versus children. And it's a never-ending spiral of who's the most vulnerable. And we need to be aware of that. We can't solve all problems, but we need to be aware of that and find ways to deal with it. Let's move on to our second discussant, and then I'll open it up to the floor. So if anybody wants to take the floor, please put up your hands and I'll come to you. Ishtiaq, you want to go next?
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Daniel, for this excellent presentation and very relevant and timely presentation. So I know we have discussed this issue several times when you were in Bangladesh, and I would like to kind of shed some light on the practice side, how it happens at the ground level. So even though we already know that the gap between community people and decision making has become a pressing debate recently, and that's why we see that a new approach that has come, locally led adaptation, has the first principle is devolving decision making to the lowest appropriate level. But why it's still alive? Why it stays alive? So I will share a story from my experience. I feel human stories are kind of more connecting when it kind of gives you a flow to understand theoretical subjects. So when I was a student, I worked with, as you said, elite organization with a foreign researcher who was a senior researcher, and they were working on a research project which we would kind of become an action project later on. So they wanted to do an evidence-based and locally driven action. And in that project, it took 2 to 3 focus group discussion and intervention to understand that the researcher were kind of towards a specific answer. So every time the person did the interviews or group discussion, he or she was kind of probing towards a specific answer, a specific solution, even though it was a need assessment. After 6 or 7 solutions from the respondent side, the person used to probe more to get that specific answer. And when the person got the answer, he or she used to spend a lot of time on that specific answer. In few cases, even where the person did not get the solution that the person wanted to have, kind of the person mouth fed that answer to the respondent. Like, don't you need these too? And the respondents are like, yeah, sure, that's also good for us. So that way, the need that the elite organization came up from the community was not actually the community need, but the need that the NGO or the elite organization had in their mind, kind of mouth fed the respondents. So that's why it stays alive. And the reason it stays alive is of some kind of understanding of these organization. And in the most recent CBA 15 conference, we had a session on LLA where a lot of grassroots practitioners also mentioned these topics, these few points that keeps this exclusion of like community people and decision making that keep going on and on. The first one is trust. I know you already have spoken about trust, but that was more of a financial trust from kind of elite organization to the local organization. But there's another kind of trust that this organization doesn't do on the community level, is the understanding of critical issues. So these researchers, that elite organization, they think community people doesn't really have that critical understanding to understand these issues and kind of come up with solutions. Lack of knowledge. That's why they want to shape it as they understand the issues. Also, access and communication, it's always one way. Every time when these elite organizations or donors communicate with the local organization or local people, it gets a communication and the local people gets an access towards that, but it never happens other way. Never, mostly the local organization or local people, they never get to access those organizations. Language, as you already have said, the CRA tool or the different tools that we use, it's kind of our language. We understand this, but the local people, they don't really understand. And that's why they get into a trap, if I use an extreme word, to kind of say what they want us to say, or they want the local organization to say. Power dynamics, you already have explained a lot. I will not go deeper into that, but I will say another thing is, which is qualitative versus quantitative. In most cases, whenever we do this sort of need assessment, we do quantitative assessment, and we do like 80% population or the community people decided to have this as intervention. But with this, what Erickson said, we kind of prioritize some other voice over other voice. And there's another story that from my experience is we were working in an Chor Island that we all know with Buddhist Chor, and we were working on similar sort of a need assessment. And most of the people said like they want embankment, a bath, and we were kind of sure that this is what the whole community, entire community need. And then I was walking by the river, and then I met a woman, older woman, and I was asking her, like, I was kind of talking to her, having a chat, and then she said she doesn't need an embankment. She needs money. I was a bit surprised, so I asked, like, why? Everyone is saying they need an embankment. But no, I don't need an embankment because it will not benefit me, because my house is on the bank of the river, and if there is an embankment, that will be 10 to 15 feet inside the land. So I will be outside of the bank. I was outside of the embankment. That's why it will not benefit. So these small nuances that we kind of lose in the quantitative assessment, and that's how, even though the organization says it's community driven, we got this whole solution idea from the community, it misses a lot of voices. And one actual example that we saw in Borguna, the village we worked for 3 years, it had a new embankment, actually 15 to 20 feet inside the land, and at least 50 households were outside the embankment. So even though it was labeled as community-driven action, 50 households were outside the embankment, that they didn't have any intervention for those households or those people. So that's why within this qualitative and quantitative data, we lose a lot of voices. And that's how we cannot, even though we think it's community driven, it's not properly or exactly community driven, or we don't get their voice as we want. So I will end with a point that first we have to acknowledge this biasness of kind of organization driven or like the top down approach. And when we acknowledge, most of the cases, we acknowledge that this is a fact and it's there, but we have to go beyond that, because we also have to acknowledge that we as a researcher or practitioner are part of this system, bias system. And then we have to think how we can get out of this. I know Celine has already shared a few examples that are very good and very relevant for this. So I will stop here. I know we don't have much time, so I'll stop here. Thank you, Dr. Haq.
Thank you so much for those comments, Ishtiaq, and I really appreciate the examples you brought in. But again, I know we don't have too much time for questions, so I won't say too much now. I'm looking forward
Great.
to
Thank you very much, Ishtiaq and Celine. We do have a few minutes for questions. Mizan, I'll ask you to come at the end. Let me take Saqib now, and if anybody else wants to take the floor, please raise your hand. Saqib?
Thank you, Dr. Haq, and thank you, Danielle, for your presentation and our two discussants, Ishtiaq and Celine. So I think a little bit of what they've touched upon, as we were doing the CBA conference last week, there was several sessions on the principles of locally led adaptation. And one sort of emerging question that everybody started to loop around to in this year's sessions was what would be the appropriate role of intermediary. So that could be organizations like us, which are more research-based, but implementation-like. Also even organizations like BRAC, which are more implementation-heavy, but less on research. But then what would be the sort of appropriate role that we would play in terms of linking the local-led initiatives, making sure that the locals indeed are leading in those discussions when they're faced with sort of national governments as part of the stakeholders that they're working with, or even international donors where the locals have very little contact with. So what would be a meaningful impact that intermediaries can play in really championing the locally led part of the initiatives?
Thank you. Danielle, I'd suggest you keep notes, and I'll give you the floor at the end. Okay. Firdausi, go ahead. Firdausi, you have to unmute. Firdausi Khatun, are you with us? You have your hand up.
So I'd like to say should focus on women education as they work inside the house, and I would like to say about narrative inquiry.
Could you repeat that? We didn't get all of it.
Narrative inquiry.
What about it?
It's a research, like a story. We should listen to storytelling and writing. So for publication.
Narrative inquiry, it's a tool or a method, is it?
It's a method.
Okay, very good.
Thank
I
you.
prefer to just call it storytelling, but that's fine. We can give it a
thank you.
fancy name. Anybody else want to take the floor and ask a question or make a comment? If not, then let me hand over to Mizan. Mizan, anything from your side? Mizan, you have to unmute.
Sure. Thank you, Danielle. Good to see you. Good to see you. But again, tomorrow, again, we'll see you, I think, each other. Am I right? Yeah, based on our latest paper project. Okay, thank you very much. I'm happy that you made a presentation on a topic that we at ICAD are trying to brainstorm and write things now. Because, under the GCA track 8, ICAD and Bangladesh, we plan to lead the LLA track. And you have actually made a presentation on locally led adaptation, the ideas and about. I'm in full consonance with your ideas. In fact, your ideas echo my mind, my thoughts. Let me share just a topic that I have been asked exactly a month later on 20th of July to be organized by the UCL on locally led adaptation. And they have asked me to become provocative, to tell something provocative. Both IIED and myself, we have been asked to with the 2 presentations. Then I sent kind of a 1 page or less than with the title that can locally led adaptation be the vehicle of transformative adaptation or just a passing fad? The title itself is very provocative because, you know, under development agency-led developments, these organizing themes of the society come in and go. Now we have this locally led adaptation, community-based adaptation we had for the last few years, then decentralized development, decentralized climate finance, all these fads we have. But most of those we experience as kind of passing. Today I attended an interesting discussion organized by the Policy Research Institute, a think tank staff, and led by the former World Bank officials, including one currently working World Bank staff. And the theme was Greener Bangladesh, building back a greener Bangladesh. And there I, on behalf of ICAD, I was the panelist. And my interventions were not liked because World Bank and those people like to, they are some kind of cocoon. They don't welcome in social engineering even ideas. They are still, you know, sleep in the classical, neoclassical economic paradigms, you know, whatever they write, whatever tools they prepare, everything looking through the prism of global development from the prism of global economics. But I have argued that we need, if we want to have real adaptation, then we need to look at the spatial economics. It's economics of the space, because we need to understand the economics grounded to some specific place, to some specific geographical arena, because the adaptation is mostly local or regional and sometimes transboundary. But these ideas were not liked by them. And the moderator has expressed that let us not criticize something like that. So I take 3 kind of parameters to kind of change this paradigm. We cannot change the paradigm, but as Celine has mentioned, we have to work together, the sensible citizens of the global societies. We have global societies, not one society, have to work together. Those 3 parameters are, to me, as number 1 is power, which very eloquently, Danielle, you have shared many of its dynamics, local, national, global, etc. The second element is about agency of an individual or a group of individuals, a community or a system. You know, so local communities, evidence bases show that local communities have real agency. They can make miracles. You know, there is huge evidence based on that in many different areas. From some dwellers, Celine knows very well. With little money, they can do miracles. And the third element about money, you know, and about resources. So I think these 3 elements, if we can kind of provide as conducive to the local communities, then we can have a real locally led adaptation without, again, being dumped as a passing fad. Thank you. And I think this is kind of a synthesis that I have been asked to do by Dr. Selim, but the last word with Dr. Selim. So over to you.
Thank you, Mizan. Let me hand over to Danielle to give her reflections, and then I'll share some thoughts to close. Danielle?
Yeah, I'll keep it pretty brief. So I want to just respond directly to some of the questions that were asked. So Saqib mentioned what would be an appropriate role for these intermediary organizations. And I think, I guess I don't have a firm answer for that. I mean, it's like, I don't want to instruct these organizations in how to do anything. But I think intermediary organizations like ECAD, I feel like ECAD and like even BRAC are in a different position than an intermediary organization that's more of an INGO that could still kind of construct themselves as an intermediary because they're still somewhat removed, or they're more located globally than locally or nationally. So I think just knowing some reflection on the fact that you are an intermediary organization, that you are in some cases being asked to translate between global and local levels. And I think that means especially giving equal weight to both the folks at the global level and the folks at the local level, and not assuming that one is more valuable than the other, because I think it's really a question of values, as Istiak brought up to trust, and understanding that no, like communities, people do actually know what they need and what would help them, and their knowledge is often valuable, if not more valuable, than what comes from the sort of expert scientists or planners who have been doing development for a while, but not necessarily adaptation and not necessarily in these places. So I think there is sort of necessarily has to be intermediary organizations. It's not going to be easy for the funders to go to every village, for example, and ask what they need and provide the proper funding, but there needs to be some more reflection on the part of intermediaries where they change how they think about like whose knowledge is valid and who should be leading the project, and how they incorporate views from both sides. For Ducey, I think I'm not really familiar with narrative inquiry. It sounds important. It sounds actually kind of, it reminded me of the like Talanoa technique that at the COPs, when Fiji hosted the COP, they introduced this idea of Talanoa, the Talanoa dialogue, which is basically about storytelling. And I think that's a really important thing. Also getting back to sort of what I think both Istiak and Salim brought up, you kind of lose a lot of the like nuances when you go to quantitative measurements or when you go to like the same solutions every time. And so being able to tell those things through stories and through more qualitative forms of data collection or just knowledge sharing is really critical. And thank you, Mizan, for all of your summary points. I would love to hear about how your talk on, I think you said July 20th goes, and how people respond to locally led adaptation and thinking about whether it's just a passing fad. I think it is important that we make sure that locally led adaptation isn't a passing fad, that it really does take on some more substance, because I mean, it's very important to make things effective. And as we know, climate change is only accelerating. And so the longer we take to do effective adaptation, the worse off everyone is. And I'll say really quickly, I see Taskia has a question in the chat. For selecting the 5 adaptation projects I went to see, I actually intended to see more. I ended up having to leave Bangladesh really abruptly because of COVID last year, which was unfortunate. But basically how I selected the projects, I was trying to get ones that were planned and funded by different types of people. So I had one that was funded by like an international climate fund and implemented by an international organization. I went to a few government projects funded through the BCCTF. The Bangladesh Trust Fund, I'm sure most of you know. And then I went to a locally led, a project that was locally led, or sorry, it was by a local NGO based in Khulna and funded by not a government donor agency, like a private donor agency. And I'm missing one of my, and an international NGO organized project. So that's sort of how I decided what I would go see, but I was hoping to see some more projects also, unfortunately, while I was in the country, but then I had to leave, but I'll be back. And I'll pass it over to Dr. Hook. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Danielle. You definitely will be back. So I'm going to conclude with a few thoughts, and I'm going to frame them in light of how do we take this conversation forward amongst ourselves. And in this conversation, I include Danielle and Salim, both as part of the ICAD family, even though they aren't here in Dhaka with us. And part of our greater efforts to enhance our own understanding of what locally led adaptation is, but also explain that understanding through practice and theory to other constituencies. And in Danielle's case, the constituency she is speaking to is the global academic constituency. And you may know, I don't know if anybody has followed, but there's a little bit of a controversy going around as to whose knowledge counts in the global climate change arena. There was a list of Reuters top experts in climate change that I was fortunate enough to be on the list, but I was a very small minority of Southern names on that list, and there were hardly any African names at all. And this is causing some controversy. People are pointing this out as a flaw in whoever made that an assessment. And whoever made that assessment used a very traditional Northern academic criteria of selection that is an exclusive criteria without knowing it. This is the biggest problem, is that bias can be inherent and unrecognized. And we all have bias. So one of the first things we all need to understand is making sure that we are not imposing our own bias. And nobody can say they don't have any bias. Everybody has some bias. Some people recognize it, some people don't recognize it. We want to recognize it. And we want to be careful not to impose it. The second arena that Celine is our representative in is working with the genuine grassroots communities. Again, we are outsiders. We are not a grassroots community. We like to feel that we want to listen to them. We want to hear their voices. We want to share their voices. We want to enhance their voices, but we are not them. We are not even their spokesperson. We need to find better ways of enhancing their voices in the fora where we have access. And that's something that we will be working on. And in particular, I have asked Celine to help us, and I'm now asking everybody in ACAD to start thinking. I want to use the next Gobeshona conference to really make a breakthrough in that. I want to impose a restriction on everybody who does a session that if you don't bring local adapters and help them tell their stories, then I don't want to hear your story. If you're an INGO doing lots of nice things, or a funder funding lots of nice things, I let you tell your story last January, the last Gobeshona conference. So we had lots of sessions, good sessions. Everybody told us their stories. We are spending 100 million there, and we are spending 40 million here, and we have this project called this and another project called that, and aren't we great? Okay, you did the show and tell in 2020, 21. In 2022, you don't get to do show and tell. And we are going to be convening a meeting with them, hopefully the end of this month in June, where I'm going to make that clear now. So if you want to come to Gobeshona in January, you have to give me the voices of the people on the ground that you claim that you are helping, and introduce me to them now. I want to talk to them, and I'll find translators to talk to them in their language. They don't have to speak English. They can speak Swahili or Hindi or Bangla or whatever. We will find translators. But I want to talk to them. I want to get to know them. And when it comes to Gobeshona in January, I will give them the floor. They will be the people who will get time to speak about their needs, about what they're doing about it, what kind of local level adaptation they are doing. I am saying that the category is a local adapter. Anybody who's not a local adapter doesn't get the floor, all right? Unless you bring us a local adapter, wherever you happen to be working, whether you're in America or in Canada or in Africa or in Asia. Local adapters are the people we want to privilege in the second Gobeshona conference in January. But we have to start that now. If we start at the end, then we won't get them. So we need to be pushing out, asking people to give us names, and we want to connect with them now, between now and January. So it's a big task for us to do that. And then the final arena that I want to invite all of you to start thinking about is in Bangladesh. As you may know, Bangladesh has, the Prime Minister of Bangladesh has just, or recently, not very recently, now it's a number of months, taken over the presidency of the Climate Vulnerable Forum. 48 of the most vulnerable countries, a very powerful, very prominent international forum of vulnerable countries. This is her second stint as the head. It's a 2-year presidency. So she will be the president during COP26 and again during COP27 next year, which will be an African COP. So that's very important point, that COP27 will be our COP. We, a vulnerable country in Africa, will be the host, and we need to start preparing and thinking about that. This year's COP is British COP. They are the ones in charge. They are the ones running around, organizing things, getting it all wrong, whatever, we can criticize them. But next year, we will be the hosts. When I say we, I mean vulnerable country. Right now, it's probably Egypt, but it may not be Egypt alone. There may be another country stepping forward. We shall see. But in any case, it will be an African COP. And so COP27, we need to start thinking and planning about. And in that context, in the Climate Vulnerable Forum context, Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina has made a very interesting assertion and got the other countries to agree to that, which is a change in narrative of the Climate Vulnerable Forum. It started off 11 years ago when President Nasheed of the Maldives started it as a vulnerable country forum. The narrative was, we are vulnerable, help us. Over time, that has shifted. It has significantly moved from not only we are vulnerable, we still are vulnerable, but we are becoming resilient. The narrative shifted from vulnerability to resilience. That already happened a few years ago. In fact, I would say when President Aquino of Philippines was the president in COP21 in Paris, that's really when the Climate Vulnerable Forum shifted the narrative from vulnerability to resilience. Now, under Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina, she wants to shift the narrative once more from resilience to prosperity. And I've written about this in my column, my Daily Star column last week. The difference between resilience and prosperity is very big. Resilience is managing risk. So we are vulnerable, we are at risk from climate change impacts. Becoming resilient means, okay, we are going to tackle those impacts and we will manage to survive through those impacts. But prosperity is another step forward. It is more transformational and leapfrogging in its conceptualization. It says not only will we be resilient and take care of the risk, we will come out the other side better off than where we were before. The country that comes out at the other end of this will be a more prosperous country despite the risk of climate change, despite being vulnerable, and by becoming more resilient. And the time frame is a 5 + 5 year time frame. 5 years to invest in looking at options for transformation. We're talking transformation, not incremental. And having identified in the first 5 years options for transformational change, the second 5 years is investing in those transformations, so that by 10 years, we are a transformed country. We are not the same country, not incrementally moving forward, but transformationally moving forward. Now, that the draft, and the other thing that the Prime Minister said is that Bangladesh will be the first country to prepare these prosperity plans. All the CVF countries agreed that they will do them over time, but Bangladesh is the first. And a draft climate prosperity plan has already been produced. It's called the Mujib Climate Prosperity Plan, which the Prime Minister named after her own father, who was the father of the country, of our nation. And the draft has been circulated, and it is now being revised and will be finalized soon. Now, one of the transformations in that, which I have inserted without elaborating on it, is locally led adaptation. Bangladesh will transform adaptation from a top-down paradigm to a bottom-up paradigm within the next 5 + 5, 10 years. That's a challenge to all of us. I'm asserting it. I don't know how to do it. But I'm saying, let us make it happen. Let us find a way to actually make it happen on the ground. And I can tell you, there'll be a lot of skeptics. Bangladeshis are very, very good at being skeptical. This morning, we had a meeting of the technical committee on this plan, and we got a lot of very negative feedback. You know, is this possible? Is that possible? This is not possible. That is not possible. Bangladeshis are extremely skeptical in their way of talking and addressing anything. We are, you know, ultra skeptics on anything. But we have to overcome skepticism. We are going to have to, you know, take on skeptics and overcome the skeptics. And that, to me, is the challenge. And I'm inviting every single person on this call, every one of you, to start thinking, how can we make that happen? It's in our hands. This is something we can do together in Bangladesh and then beyond Bangladesh in other countries as well, and at the global level as well. So let me leave you with that thought and thank Danielle again for provoking this discussion, getting us going. I should also make a plug for the next presentation, which will be by Lisa Schipper from Oxford. And she, in fact, is going to be talking about something similar. So they have done some very interesting analysis of adaptation projects that are supposedly good adaptation projects. And they found that they were actually maladaptation in the end, rather than good adaptation. And so another area of you know, learning that we need to be involved in. So with that, I know we've gone over time, but thank you all very much for spending the time with us. I hope Danielle, Celine, and Ishtiaq don't mind us sharing the recording. I think this is a very rich discussion, and we will package the recording and share it widely with people that we feel should be engaged in this discussion and should be listening to our discussions and recognize that ICCAD is actually one of the leading institutions that is taking this intellectual issue forward in a very significant way. So thank you very much, everybody. Let's call it an evening for now. And thank you, Danielle. Looking forward to seeing you in person sometime, somewhere.
Soon, hopefully. Yeah. Thank you all so much. It was really nice seeing everyone and talking to you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you again.
Thank you, Danielle.
Bye-bye.